Welcome to the Bogosity podcast for the 16th of July 2012, the podcast that engages in unimmaculate conception. This is your host, Shane Killian. Let's overcharge the news of the bogus. In last week's Obamacare special, I speculated that the recent court decision could give the federal government the power to restrict anything, and I used abortion as an example. Well, now, an evangelical Christian has come out in favor of just one such power, taxing atheists who do not go to church. Brian Fisher of the American Family Association advocated the measure on his radio show, Focal Point.
Hey, what we ought to do is we ought to have an individual mandate from the government that everybody has to go to church. And we are going to tax the atheists who don't go to church. Now, we can't make you go to church, but we are going to penalize you if you don't.
Okay, it's hard to tell if he's being serious or if he's just making the same point I am. Clearly, he wants people to go to church, so he's not, in Jonathan Swift fashion, arguing against his position as I was. But he still could be using this just to make a point, to say to atheists, see, we could do this to you if we wanted to. And in that, scarily enough, he is absolutely right. What, you think the First Amendment's protection of freedom of religion will protect you from this? Let's consider the Obamacare decision again. The court ruled that the individual mandate was not allowed under the Commerce Clause and the Necessary and Proper Clause. But if it's a tax, that doesn't matter. The restrictions of Article 1, Section 8 do not apply. Further, the only restrictions in Section 9 that they said applied were the restrictions on capitations and direct taxes. The other restrictions do not apply. The Fourth Amendment says that your assets may only be seized after government obtains a warrant supported by probable cause. But call it a tax, and the Fourth Amendment restrictions do not apply. The Fifth Amendment says that government cannot deprive you of life, liberty, or property without due process. But since no due process is involved with collecting this tax, which the law absolutely calls a penalty, this decision abrogates the Fifth Amendment as well. The Seventh Amendment says if it's over $20, you get a jury trial. Again, this was completely abrogated by the ruling. So not only do the non-tax restrictions in Article 1, Sections 8 and 9 not apply, but three different amendments of the Bill of Rights likewise pose no restrictions on this taxation power. The First Amendment has no special status that the Fourth, Fifth, and Seventh Amendments don't. So if those amendments don't apply, then neither, according to this precedent, would the first. Meaning your freedom of religion, according to the court, can in no way be used as an argument against paying this penalty. Maybe Fisher's not being serious. Maybe he's not actually lobbying for this. Or if he is, maybe he doesn't have enough influence to get it passed into law. But it's only a matter of time before someone does. And it could be anything. Imagine a marriage tax that heterosexual couples get a credit for, essentially a gay marriage fine. Or maybe schools that teach evolution would pay an evolution tax and get a credit if they give equal time to intelligent design. The only limitations are the demented imaginations of those who would control our lives, and whatever resolve exists in Congress to stop them. But the Constitution is no longer any limitation on anything any such group would do. Suppose you want to have a baby. With modern technology, you have a choice. You can do it the old-fashioned way, or you can do it through in vitro fertilization with a sperm donor. But here's the kicker. Although you can have a baby with anyone the old-fashioned way, if you want to use a sperm donor, the donor has to undergo mandatory FDA testing that costs about $800. That's what a San Francisco woman found out when she wanted to have a baby. She's a lesbian, and she and her female partner want to have a child, the biological father being a friend that they trust. But they'd have to pay the $800 to have the testing done, and if it didn't work, and it often takes several tries to get it right, they have to pay another $800 for each attempt. Essentially, she's being charged $800 a pop for not having sex with the donor. Now, the anonymous woman has filed suit against the FDA, stating that she, quote, does not want to be forced to engage in sexual intercourse with a male partner to conceive a child. even though such a male partner would not be subject to FDA-required screening and testing and other FDA-mandated donor eligibility requirements. What sense does it make to say that any schmendrick can do the deed with a woman and get her pregnant, but if he wants to donate his sperm to her, all of a sudden he has to be checked out to make sure he's eligible? In effect, this is nothing more than an $800 penalty being levied against her because she won't have sex with a man. How is this defensible? I'm sure that no regulators actually intended such a horrific and bigoted outcome. But this is one more example of well-meaning politicians and bureaucrats writing rules that the rest of us have to follow, that they think are for the public good, that they think will keep us safe, that have these crazy side effects, unintended consequences that result in well-meaning people writing despicable regulations. Interestingly, one of those silver linings with the Obamacare ruling we talked about last week may help her. The Supreme Court confirmed that the Commerce Clause was not a blank check for the government to do whatever it wants. Although one might argue that the in vitro fertilization process is commerce, it's not interstate commerce. And getting the sperm donated isn't commerce at all because no money is changing hands. Indeed, this is a private matter between the two of them, about as private as you can get. So now that the Commerce Clause is more solidly restricted as it's supposed to be, she just may prevail in her arguments that these FDA requirements are unconstitutional and a hideous violation of privacy. On the other hand, all the FDA would have to do is call the $800 a tax and they just might prevail. Good luck to this unnamed woman in her fight against ridiculous, not to mention sexist and homophobic regulations. But the sad part of the matter is, this is probably just the first of many such quandaries we'll see in the wake of the Supreme Court ruling. Meanwhile, over in Germany, Marcel Pohl was whizzing his way through the university system, completing 60 examinations in 20 months, gaining both a bachelor's and a master's degree. Now the university, FOM, is suing him because it normally takes 11 semesters to go through this course, and Pohl only needed 3. FOM is saying that Pohl owes them an extra 3,000 euros, about $3,700 in US money, because that's how much taking those extra semesters would have cost him. According to FOM, their fees are for the total price of the studies and has nothing to do with how long it takes. Gee, I wonder if that means they owe a refund to slower students who took longer than 11 semesters to get their degrees. According to Pohl, quote, "When I got the lawsuit, I thought it couldn't be true. Performance is supposed to be worth something." According to Pohl's lawyer, Bernhard Cross, quote, "We're always against slow students, but when someone hurries and finishes early, suddenly he has to pay. That can't be right." But the FOM is claiming lost income because of the money they would have gotten if Pohl had taken the entire 11 semesters to finish his degrees. But Pohl is really confused by this, since he told the school his accelerated plan in advance, and they agreed to it. The plan involved him and 2 of his friends taking courses simultaneously and exchanging notes. And what does the FOM have to say about all of this? Quote, "We do not want to comment on the case before it has reached court." Gee, I wonder why. Scientists have been studying the medicinal effects of marijuana for decades, but the US government, despite having medical marijuana patients on their rolls that they send marijuana cigarettes to every month for free, has denied tooth and nail that there are any medicinal benefits. But now, a government-sponsored study has confirmed that this policy is wrong. The study, published in the Open Neurology Journal, confirmed the pain-relieving effects of marijuana and also its efficacy in relieving symptoms of nausea and vomiting, as well as stimulating appetite. In addition, it confirmed that it helps with the neuropathic pain and spasticity associated with multiple sclerosis. It recommended additional trials to study these effects more closely. Quote, "As these therapeutic potentials are confirmed, it will be useful if marijuana and its constituents can be prescribed, dispensed, and regulated in a manner similar to other medications that have psychotropic effects and some abuse potential. Given that we do not know precisely which cannabinoids or in which combinations achieve the best results, larger and more representative clinical trials of the plant product are warranted. because cannabinoids are variably and sometimes incompletely absorbed from the gut, and bioavailability is reduced by extensive first-pass metabolism, such trials should include delivery systems that include smoking, vaporization, and oral mucosal spray in order to achieve predictable blood levels and appropriate titration. Advances in understanding the medicinal indications and limitations of cannabis in its various forms should facilitate the regulatory and legislative processes. The study directly attacks the DEA's placement of marijuana as a Schedule I narcotic. Quote, "The classification of marijuana as a Schedule I drug, as well as the continuing discovery as to whether or not cannabis is of medical value, are obstacles to medical progress in this area. Based on evidence currently available, the Schedule I classification is not tenable. It is not accurate that cannabis has no medical value, or that information on safety is lacking. It is true cannabis has some abuse potential, but its profile more closely resembles drugs in Schedule III, where codeine and dronabinol are listed." Here's hoping our politicians are listening, but our guess is they're not. We have a president who has not only admitted to, but joked about smoking marijuana and maybe a little blow. Every president for the last 20 years has taken an illegal narcotic of some kind at some time in their lives, yet they all think that you people need to go to prison if you do the same thing. Their hope that, quote, "the continuing conflict between scientific evidence and political ideology will hopefully be reconciled in a judicious manner," seems little more than wishful thinking, unless the voters of this country finally wake up and vote out both the Democrats and the Republicans and vote in people from other parties whose policies on these issues much more closely matches reality. And now it's time to ferociously filibuster this week's biggest Bogon emitter. It hasn't exactly been a secret that creationists and other social conservatives are out to undermine critical thinking in our schools. It's probably the one thing our schools should be doing above all, isn't doing anywhere near enough of, and now the Texas GOP wants to remove what little of it exists. But they're not being coy about it this time. They're not shielding it under religious freedom or teach the controversy. No, in their official 2012 platform, the Republican Party of Texas directly opposes the teaching of critical thinking skills, by name. It's on page 12, under the heading Educating Our Children. Quote, "We oppose the teaching of higher order thinking skills, critical thinking skills, and similar programs that are simply a relabeling of outcome-based education, which focus on behavior modification and have the purpose of challenging the student's fixed beliefs and undermining parental authority." I suppose it was just a matter of time. With critical thinking skills, it becomes easy to see that evolution is overwhelmingly supported by the scientific evidence, and creationism is so weak it doesn't even meet the minimum criteria for a scientific theory. With critical thinking skills, it becomes easy to see that the only way to get anything worthwhile out of Bronze Age religious texts is to sift through it and throw out the bigotry, genocide, misogyny, and other things that absolutely disqualify them from being anything resembling a moral guidebook. And with critical thinking skills, it becomes easy to see that the economic policy employed by Democrats and Republicans alike of subsidizing big corporations and waiting for the wealth to trickle down is just a load of nonsense that isn't supported by any empirical observations whatsoever. And of course, that's exactly what Republicans are afraid of. Folks, the school system in this country has never been about teaching kids to think for themselves or undermining authority. It's about cranking out good little citizens that will never question what their holy preachers, both in churches and in government, tell them. As one of the most praised teacher manuals in history, William Begley's Classroom Management says on the subject, quote, "One who studies educational theory aright can see in the mechanical routine of the classroom the educative forces that are slowly transforming the child from a little savage into a creature of law and order, fit for the life of civilized society." An education should challenge beliefs and undermine authority. That is the only real benefit one can get from an education, and that's precisely why government should have no role in it whatsoever. Education is all about challenging beliefs and undermining authority, which is why authoritarians want to control it and stop it from doing exactly that. And this has been true since the days of Socrates. Which is why the Texas GOP made themselves a shoo-in for this week's biggest Bogon emitter. And now it's time to teleport to Lord Xenu this week's
Idiot Extraordinaire!
Let's face it, the Scientologists have been gunning for this award like no other, and they finally made it in the wake of their poster boy Tom Cruise's divorce from Katie Holmes. Apparently, Holmes didn't like the fact that Cruise wanted to send their daughter Suri to a Scientologist camp and indoctrinate her into the pseudo-religion. Tough to blame her. Now the Scientologists are fighting back against a mother's right to not have her daughter's head filled with complete nonsense by urging their members to persuade sites run by Google and Microsoft to take down anti-Scientology content. That's right, outright censorship. In the email they sent to members, they said, quote, bad grammar and all, "So is you go to MSN now, what's trending, you will see different articles about TC and Holmes split. The articles then ask for comment. On each comment, if you place your mouse over it, it will show up on the bottom right a tag that say report. Click the report tag and a small window show up. Click the tab send note to moderate." Oh, geez, I can't quote any more of this. It's like reading the instructions for a Chinese waffle iron. Basically, they're getting their members to report anti-Scientology content as a violation of their terms of service. Scientologists worship Cruise not only for his fame, but also for, get this, his telekinetic and telepathic powers. According to Scientologists, Cruise is an operative thetan, which means he has total control over himself and his environment. Guess that environment must not extend to Katie Holmes, huh? OTs are said to have the ability to move inanimate objects with their minds, leave their bodies, and telepathically communicate with others, including getting them to change their behavior. Well, I guess that would explain how such a lame actor got so many leading roles in otherwise great movies. But Holmes divorcing him would suggest that perhaps there are some limitations to this supernatural state of being. So any news story showing Cruise for the brainless moron that he so obviously is will inevitably draw the ire of the idiotic adherents of this fake religion based on a bad science fiction book. And apparently, there's no such thing as a moderate Scientologist. They see this divorce as an attack on their religion. Folks, an attack on any religion is not hate speech. And when you think about it, Scientology, with its belief that we're all the descendants of the prisoners of evil galactic overlord Xenu, really isn't that much crazier than saying we came from a man made of clay and a woman made from a rib, and were saved by a man who was born, even though his mother didn't have sex, and he walked on water and raised the dead but couldn't even manage a simple political movement. But the fact that yet another celebrity divorce, which no thinking person should really care about to begin with, poses such a threat to them and their insanity, could only mean that these Scientologists are this week's
Idiot Extraordinaire!
Well, that wraps up this religion-hating, nutcase-baiting, much-berating, ego-deflating, cheap gold-plating, celebrating, and low-bond rating edition of the Bogosity podcast. Please visit the forums at Bogosity.tv, where you can read the show notes and join the discussion on these and other subjects. This podcast is free, but not free to produce, so please use the donate button at the top of the Bogosity.tv website or down the right-hand side of the podcast page and give generously to keep this podcast going. And if you'd like to contribute to the podcast, just send a question, statement, news article, or rant to podcast@bogosity.tv. Put it in an audio file, and if it's good enough, it'll get played right in the podcast. Thank you for listening. Until next time, here's a quote from Harry Browne. "If you give a good politician the power to do good things, you automatically give a bad politician the power to do bad things." The Bogosity podcast is licensed under Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives 3.0 Unported License.
Bogosity.